Welcome to Troubadour. Thanks for
Hey,
coming,
Kirk.
or thanks for meeting with me. And
Yeah,
I, have known you for a little while. I've followed your work. So really quickly to start us off, actually, I have a feeling most people who are watching this might know you, but I had a really weird experience that was kind of shocking to me because I think of you as like this a figure, especially in Austin, but just in the field of just being pretty well known, actually. And I was with these objectivists, these fans of Ayn Rand. I do clubs
yeah.
around that. And I asked them, I told them, I'm going to have, I think I'm going to have Razib Khan on the show or something. And people are like, who's that? And I was like, who? So I think I actually might be able to introduce you to some objectivists.
Taking
Uh,
me down, taking me down a notch there, Kirk.
yeah, sorry, man. Well, I mean, like, ask people who Kirk Barbera is where you are. Nobody knows who the hell I am. So
Okay.
it's an interesting thing about the worlds we live in, right?
Yeah,
Now, some people did know you, like a friend of mine, Connor, met you, was a big fan. So I'm not saying
sure.
nobody, but I was surprised that these individuals didn't know you. That was my point.
Yeah.
So I
Yeah,
hope I get to introduce you to some
we're
objectivists.
yeah, we're gonna fix that. We're gonna
Yeah,
fix that.
exactly. We're gonna fix that. Now, but first, if you could start us by telling like an elevator pitch of what you do on your blog, your podcast, and your intellectual work.
Yeah. So I have a Substack right now called Razib Khan's Unsupervised Learning. That is basically my main blog now. If you go to razib.com, you'll see other links. Like I write for Palladium. I used to write for Unheard sometimes. I go back to that. I write for Quillette. I would say in terms of my intellectual production, most of my venues are centrist, center right to further right. I write for the Dispatch, which is like Never Trump kind of publications. I write for National Review, whatever. I'll write for anybody. This is kind of my philosophy. And I read about a lot of times. I read about history, politics, and genetics and sociobiology. That sort of thing. My
Yeah.
training is as a population geneticist. So Hardy Weinberg equilibrium, selection coefficients, these sorts of things. If your listeners know what that means, I also work in computational genomic frameworks. So that basically means that I take population genetic theory. This is my training in graduate school at UC Davis, and I deploy it in the context of modern computing, big data coming in from whole genome sequencing. I'm a big fan of genomics and whole genome sequencing. My older son is the first human who was whole genome sequenced
Yeah.
before he was born in the world. You can Google that, Razib Khan son. That'll come up. I'm interested in personal genomics. I'm interested in population genetics. That is my evolutionary biological interest. I'm interested in questions like that relating to populations, how they evolve and how they're different, stuff like that. Some of the stuff that's got me in trouble or controversial are things that relate to group differences among humans, which supposedly do not exist, but they actually do. So, I am interested in that topic, although, I'm not like super obsessed with it. What I will say is, I'm kind of the type of person that doesn't shy from a direct question. I will give the direct answer, and that is, as they say, problematic today, but I don't really care. I think you know that. I mean,
Sure. Sure.
I'm a jokey guy, but I will just say whatever I want to say, and I've kind of made a
Yeah.
life based around that. I also work in tech. I don't talk about that right now in terms of just like kind of like different brands. So probably figure out where I work if you really want to go to LinkedIn, but
Yeah.
that's a separate thing. Interested in artificial technology and stuff like that. This is part of my work as a computational biologist. So, I'm interested in evolutionary biology. That took me to population genetics. Population genetics took me to genomics and computational biology, which took me to artificial intelligence and machine learning. Okay, so
Mhm.
that's kind of like that, like
Mhm.
STEM spectrum.
Yeah.
I know that you're more of a humanities guy, and
Yeah.
I'm deeply interested in history, in
Yeah.
ancient history, classical history, medieval history, all types of history. Modern history somewhat too, but I feel like that's kind of the thing where you can almost absorb from your zeitgeist.
Hmm.
Watching the History Channel and stuff like that. So
Yeah.
I do know a fair amount of modern history, but if you want to talk about like how Charles Martel usurped the throne, or not the throne, but usurped the position of mayor of the palace from his legitimate younger brother. I can talk to you about that, which like most people cannot, right? I have
Yeah.
some
I
interesting
can't.
topics like that. Yeah, yeah. But most
Yeah.
people don't know that. Most people don't know Charles Martel was a bastard. It's just that
Okay.
his younger legitimate brother was very young, was like a tween, and so he was like in his 20s already. And so the nobles of, New Austria, or in Austrasia decided, Francia decided, okay, let's put the bastard on the throne. Not the throne, because he was a mayor, he wasn't the king yet. But anyway, my point is, I have interests like that. I synthesize them with genetics, because genetics can answer a lot of historical questions. So, for example, I'm just going to give your listeners a concrete example. The Rurikids are the ruling dynasty
The
of
what kids?
the Rurikids.
Oh,
Rurik
Rurik.
was a Varangian, a Viking, a Swede who established Kiev and Rus. The Russians were actually originally Vikings. They're Nordic people, probably it possibly is from the Finnish word for Swede, which is Ruotsi. Um, and so genetically, we actually know what that paternal lineage is. And it's
Mhm.
actually a Finnish lineage, ironically. So that opens some interesting questions of who the Rurikids were and who these Vikings were. Were they actually Scandinavianized Finns that eventually conquered Slavic people, were Slavicized? And it was Rurik's grandson, Vladimir, I think his grandson, who converted to Russian or Orthodox Christianity and kind of established the trajectory of Russian civilization. So this is obviously a big cultural historical question. But with genetics, we actually know that the Rurikids were a real lineage, and that the modern Russian nobility, to a substantial extent, descends from the Rurikids. I mean, the Romanovs are maternal. The Romanovs, which are more well known to moderns, because they took they became the czars in the 17th century. They are, I believe, a maternal line descendant of the Rurikids, not a paternal. But in any
So
case, yeah,
yeah, I want to okay dig into this a little bit because there's a view of history that I've picked up from what you're saying that's very, very different, I think, than my
yeah,
view of history
yeah,
and what
yeah,
moves history and what I think is important in it and also our identities. And I'm seeing this now, but you do have like a lot of experience and knowledge in genetics in general. And so I
yeah.
do want to ask a little bit about that to kind of get us in there a little quickly. So my ignorant view and learning a little bit from you and a few other people maybe is genetics can like to me the biggest value that genetics really has is helping us see certain biological markers in ourselves so we can understand our own health knowledge about ourselves. That is one of the chief values that I can see in it is that we might get to a point where we can see what kind of problems might accrue with infants obviously and help alleviate them before they happen. Then I also see this. And so is that correct? That's a one of the chief values.
That's how it gets funded.
And now the
Yeah,
second thing that I hear from you though is this identification thing. So this idea that you have these markers that so Russia is actually Finnish because they have certain genetic markers in relations, or is that something like that? Correct?
that
Right?
sort of thing. Yeah.
That's where I'm obviously, or not obvious, that's where I'm in disagreement now. Now, I'm not disagreement that the genetic markers are present. I'm
Yeah.
just disagreeing, or my initial gut reaction disagreement, and I want to learn a little bit more about this, is that that's almost irrelevant to what makes them Russian
Yeah.
versus Finnish. Like
Yeah.
it's not like I'm sure there's certain kinds of traits I've heard you talk about that can be passed on. Yes, I don't doubt that, but I'm much more a view of it's the fundamental ideas that we have. That's what makes us who we are. And, and again, I'm obviously influenced by Ayn Rand. This is a big idea that Ayn Rand has. So it's the ideas that you accept that make you who you are. And a good
Yeah.
example of that is you could take someone who's genetically in any culture, they could and bring them to America and they have American ideals, right? If
Yeah.
they're
Yeah.
raised at a certain way. So like that's where I want to say the word that honestly comes to my mind is concerned about the genetic arguments that I hear in tying our ideological um
Yeah.
if our lineage in that way and saying
Yeah.
like look at these but go ahead, let me hear what you
Yeah,
have
let
to
me
say.
clarify too. One way I explain it. Genetics is a record of your genealogy, right? It's a record of your genealogy, and it also gives you your dispositions for the future. So what genetics can do, it can project you as an individual into the future. What diseases are you going to get? How are you going to develop and evolve? Like, what are you going to look like before you're born? Okay. So that is like the genetic record of you predicting into the future. But genetics, with all 3 billion base pairs, is also a record of your genealogy. And you are the terminal node in this vast tree that extends into the past. And so think of yourself as this point, and that point is the end of a vast tree. You are like the point of the vertex of this vast tree fanning into the past. So you have a record of the whole past from just you, from your 3 billion base pairs. So that's a lot of information. And from those 3 billion base pairs, you can project in a single line to your terminus, to your life trajectory. And that is the health and well-being that you're talking about, right? So those are 2 ways that you can think about it. So imagine it's a time machine. It's a past time machine and it's a future time machine. Okay, so that's one way that you can think about it, and I think that's what you were getting at. Okay,
Well, the
now
future is the one I'm concerned about and interested in. But yeah, go ahead.
sure, well, you are, but I mean, other people are very interested in genealogy. You're not, from what I can tell,
No,
right?
I'm
But
interested in genealogy, like I said, because I want to know about my health. I think it's important. I agree with your mission of getting everyone to have a
yeah.
genetic. I'm
Oh
all
yeah, yeah,
for
yeah,
that.
yeah. Oh, yeah. So like, but mechanically, like, some cultures are different. Like, so for example, Ashkenazi Jews, um, you know, Jewishness is determined through your maternal lineage, right? And so like they care about genealogy because it establishes nationhood, right? Which is
Sure.
not the American way. And in fact, like most nations in the world still have birthrights, like citizenship by blood, right? Not citizenship by birth. And so that's why genealogy is important. Historically, humans seem to be mostly monogamous, although there are some polygamous humans. But males are very concerned about paternity certainty, and that's why genealogy is incredibly important because they don't want to invest in offspring that aren't theirs, right? So that's
Sure.
from the evolutionary perspective why genealogy is important. This is on the individual level. Why it is relevant on, say, tracking demographic changes is because obviously culture is plastic, but people as groups and their histories affect how they uptake a culture and how they transform a culture. So I'll give you a great example. As an objectivist, Ayn Rand is Russian and she grew up in a Russian milieu, but she was an Ashkenazi Jew. And that's a very distinct subculture within Russia. It is viewed as a separate race and a separate ethnicity by Gentile, by non-Jewish Russians, right? It's a nationality in the former Soviet Union and to some extent Russia today. Highly well integrated, but it's still viewed as a separate race. They also have a separate culture, obviously a separate religion, and objectivism. Early objectivism was highly, highly enriched for Ashkenazi Jews. Nathaniel Brandon from that background, Barbara, I forget her name now, but Barbara, his wife, also Barbara Brandon, I think that was her name, but
That's right.
I forget
Yeah.
her maiden name. I forget her maiden name.
Oh
And
yeah.
then like Leonard Peikoff, obviously Ayn Rand. It's not exclusively, obviously, but it's highly enriched for Ashkenazi Jews. Alan Greenspan, who was part of the circle, also Jewish. I'm not saying that objectivism is in the Jewish genes, but it's overrepresented. It's a highly intellectualized movement. Jews are a highly literate, intellectualized population, right? And so their history informs their attraction to certain ideologies, whether it be Marxism on the left, objectivism, which like I'm not going to give it an ideological positioning to not offend any of you guys. I know you're very particular about that, but even among like right wing movements, like say like right libertarianism, Jews are very very well represented. They're not very well represented in populist movements. Okay, and why is that? Well, I mean, just look at their socioeconomic position, I look at their like representative professions, et cetera, et cetera. And so just by creating a demarcation of this group, you have some information. So how do you create the demarcation? There's different ways. Like you can do it just by like a religion. Okay, like if you're Christian, if you're Pentecostal. I mean, obviously, people are Pentecostal because their parents are Pentecostal, but it's like a 0.5 correlation, right? We all just intuitively understand you can convert, you accept Jesus Christ. But there are other groups, like if you're an African American, okay, like Kirk, you could be like, I'm into like Black culture and everything like that. But like, if you just said I'm an African American, people will be like, okay, you can say whatever you want, but it's a little ridiculous. And
Sure.
what African American is, you kind of have to look a certain way, are raised in a certain family and have a certain history. It's not that be African American as a culture is inscribed on the genes, but the culture is transmitted to a group of people that are connected by their genealogy. Does that make sense?
Yes, I mean well, it makes sense in a certain part, but I mean there's still an element that I'm not seeing that is connecting. And this a question I have for you is so because what it all sounds to me is a kind of sociological determinism. So it's that this idea that we're
No, 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 no,
determined
no.
by
It's not determinism, it's probabilism. So like, you
well, that
being a
seems like a
geneticist.
form of determinism. It's just a
Okay, well,
different.
yeah, I don't consider it determinism. I mean, like, I come out of
Okay.
population genetics, it's all
Well,
probabilistic, right?
then let me
And I know this is a disagreement between objectivists and population genetics.
sure, but I don't even that is not even relevant. All I want to because I'm again trying to understand this. So like, let me just put it this way: do you think we could get to a time in the technology, in the knowledge um, of genealogy that we can actually, or genetics, sorry, that we can actually take a baby, have so much massive amounts of information and ways of processing it that we can quite literally predict not just what they look like, their health patterns, but a lot other things like who they'll associate with, the kind of person they'll marry, and things of that nature. Do you think that
We can,
that
al-
is potentially possible?
we can already do some of that. It'll get better. We can already, there's limits to that because there's limits to how much of the outcome in your life is due to parameters that we can adduce, right? Even if you assume underlying everything that like the world is, let's just assume that's a clockwork world. We do not have we do not have visibility on a lot of the things, so it's operationally seems like there's a random noise element to it because we don't understand. But the way you do it mathematically in genetics and other fields is, you just apportion variation based on the variables that you can control. So something like height, we say that height is about 80 to 90% heritable, right? And that just means that 80 to 90% of the variation in the population is due to variation in genes. We know that. And I think that's intuitively obvious. The
Sure.
correlation between siblings is zero point 0.5. The correlation between parent and offspring is zero point 0.5. It's, it's determined by genes. The genes are swapped around and mixed around. And so that's why they're not like perfectly correlated. But it's mostly genes. Okay, we know that. Something like intelligence, the heritability is around 50%. So what does that mean? Well, it means that some of it is due to genes. Like smart people tend to have smarter offspring. Dumb people tend to have dumber offspring, but they tend to. There's a very imperfect correlation, and there's a lot of outliers and exceptions. And so you can make some population-wide judgments and guesses in a group of people. Or let's say, here's the most heritable profession in the United States is college professor. Okay, that means that like if you're a college professor, you're much more likely to be a college professor if your parents are a college professor to a greater degree than any other profession, greater
Hmm.
than doctors, lawyers, whatever, accountants. Okay,
Doctors, really? That's interesting.
yes, it's higher than
Interesting.
doctors. I think the main reason is academia has much more tacit information that will allow you to get ahead than in professions like medicine or law, which also there is actually a privilege, a high privilege to having a parent who's in that profession. But those professions are somewhat more straightforward in terms of their evaluations and the hoops you have to jump. So there is an element that's just cultural transmission. Like, if you're from an academic family, there's certain things that you have to do that are unwritten rules. Okay. So there's some of that. But also some of it is just like the type of personality you have. So for example, doctors are extremely high in medical doctors are very high in conscientiousness. Candidly, I think everyone who's an academic and who's a medical doctor will say that of the two groups, medical doctors are less intellectually curious. They're very smart, but I know many medical doctors who just like had no other intellectual interests after medical school aside from medicine. Then
But
they
do you think
retired.
that that's
Yeah,
genetically
yeah. It is
ingrained?
genetic. It is genetic. It
But
is partly genetic. It's
so
partly genetic. Okay. Again,
okay,
it's partly heritable. Like we know this. This is in the literature. It's not
but
controversial. Like
if you took the kid like a bit so who had
yeah,
high not and put them in a culture in a Jewish family which has the kind of intellectual curiosity,
yeah,
will
yeah.
they gain enough curiosity? That's my
They
fundamental, and
they
that,
do.
even that's not
Yeah,
my fundamental question. That's one of
well,
my questions.
they do to some extent, but a lot of it actually disappears after adulthood. What we see in the literature is that families, adopted children, are extremely shaped by their families when they're children, and then starting at 18, when they become adults, they slowly start diverging, and they lose a lot of that effect. And the reason they lose a lot of that effect is they start to make choices and decisions based on their own dispositions, which might be somewhat different than what their adoptive family wants. I'll give you a concrete example. I have a friend who I didn't know he was adopted until I asked him because it started to get strange. And he comes from a professional managerial family in the Bay Area, Millbrae, and everybody in his family works for like Microsoft or Meta or eBay and stuff like that. And he went to college. He got college degrees, and it was expected in his family. But what ended up happening, and I'm in my 40s now, he's in his 40s, is that he kept rejecting promotions into managerial positions and kept wanting to stay hourly. And he is making a lot of money, but he wanted to stay an hourly employee. And he would be frustrated. His parents are both deceased now, but he would be frustrated when we were younger that his parents would just like complain about this. Like, why are you doing this? They didn't understand. And he's like, I just don't want to be tied down. He liked to travel and be flexible. And they were just like nose to the grind people that wanted to ascend a corporate ladder. And that was his whole family. And he's like, I'm just different. I'm just different. And one day I blurted out, I'm like, wait, I mean, do you think you could be adopted? He's like, I am adopted. It just never come up. Okay. And I was like, okay, like, do you know what your biological parents did? He's like, yeah, my biological dad was a musician and my biological mom is a potter. Okay. So they were bohemians.
Sure.
And he lives a bohemian life. At the beginning of when I graduated from college with him, he was on the corporate path. And then like around like 27, he purposely decided to just not do that because he could not imagine himself being a cubicle guy for 30 years. Okay. Anyway, my point here is he had a certain personality. He tried to reject that personality because he had very strong he had great parents. They treated him well. He loved them. But the reality is he realized he wasn't like them. And this actually like caused a lot of angst in his 30s. And I didn't know he was adopted this whole time. And then later he admitted to me he was adopted. And then I was like, do you think you could be more like your biological parents? When he told me what they did, he was like, I hadn't thought of that. Well, you should have, because they were free spirits, is what. There's a record. The adoption agency had a record of what they were like. If you ever wanted to, and he never like tracked them down or anything like that. He's not interested in that. But anyway, they were free spirits. He's a free spirit, and it's just that's the truth.
So I worked at a school long time ago, and and it had infant all the way to eighth grade.
Yeah.
And now I only worked there for 2 years, but I, was talking to people who'd been there for a while, and they would definitely, I'd have like there'd be like a first grader or something, and there's or a whole class of first graders. Oh, go ahead, Edith.
No. Sorry.
Yeah, so a whole like class of first graders, but they had known them since they were infants, and the teachers would talk about, you could see personality traits in the infants that are now present in the first grader, right? And just ways that they act, the ways that they, laugh at things, don't laugh at how serious or not or whatever. So the idea that we have certain kinds of traits in us, I definitely agree with. And so I agree with a lot of the things that you're saying in the sense of we do have some kind of baseline traits that we're born with. But I guess where I diverge is the level of flexibility, and because I believe in free will, that we have to change ourselves, to shift into new things. Not to, I think and this is a whole other conversation, but just completely, I don't mean to completely deny the way that you work, but I think you can make yourself, for instance, more or less conscientious, more or less able to focus. I think that's a trainable skill. I think you can make yourself more or less adventurous, more or less, like I think those types of things can happen.
I don't disagree with that. Like, if you think that this is like something I disagree with, and you don't understand what I'm saying, I mean, candidly. So I'll give you a concrete example. And you could have a gene for alcohol. You could have a gene for high risk for alcoholism, right?
Sure.
If you're raised in a Mormon family and you live in Provo, Utah, you're much less likely to become an alcoholic.
To enact that issue.
It's not
part of your culture.
Life.
Yeah.
And so
you're not activating it essentially.
So I have a friend. He's actually, well, he's not working anymore because he's worth $100 million. But very brilliant guy with ADHD. And when he decided to work on his startup, he actually did a thing where he air gapped his computer. He had air gapped computers that were not connected to the internet, and he would put his phone away. And so from like 9 until 3 p.m. So he had 6 straight hours when it was like 1985. And actually, it was like 1880 because he would put his phone away. Like,
I got it.
have to walk into his office to interrupt him, and that was all. So
Yeah.
he had no distraction because he knew he had ADHD and he wouldn't get things done.
Yeah.
But those 6 hours, he had like massive productivity gains. So he did something, a proactive choice based on what he knew about himself.
Self-knowledge. Yeah. And I think
Yes, he
like,
did.
yeah, and so genetics teaching Kirk about my behaviors and view and things like that and my health, yeah, is a form of self-knowledge. And again, I think this is where I definitely I think is really important about genetics and teaching me about myself. So that way I can shape,
Yeah.
my environment to kind of achieve the goals that I want to achieve. So okay, I think we're in agreement there. I think that makes sense. In the history situation, I'm curious what you're relate, like what you think this is teaching us about the, understanding history, like you were talking
Sure.
about Russians and Finnish. So, is your argument that there's certain behavioral traits or traits in general in the Finns that passed on to the Russians, and that explains something about the Russians of that time?
Probably, but I don't actually make that argument because that's like a harder argument to make and it
Okay,
requires a lot more work. I'll give you a concrete example of what I
please.
mean.
Yeah.
So, in the late Neolithic, early Bronze Age in Eastern Europe, there's a culture called the corded ware culture. It's called the corded ware culture because the pots have like cord
Mm,
impressions on them. So there's like a
mm,
particular type of pot. They're like, okay, so archaeologists, a huge group of archaeologists, had this argument that the corded ware culture evolved out of this other culture called the globular amphora, which is Neolithic. And they showed how these early Neolithic people became middle Neolithic, became late Neolithic, became Bronze Age, and then the corded ware people evolved into other people like the Slavic people, right? So
yeah.
they had this whole lineage, and they explained by how the cultures evolved and transformed, right? What happened in 2015 is a bunch of archaeologists took DNA from these corded ware people and compared them with the globular amphora people. And what they saw was that about 25% of the ancestry of corded ware people were globular amphora, but 75% were totally different people that showed up within 20 years.
Mm,
Okay. And of that 25% that's globular amphora, and you can figure this out, it's almost all women.
okay.
Okay. And so, no, like it was not a natural evolution out of the globular amphora. There was a break. Okay. We know this now from demographics. What we also know from archaeology is it looks like in this region, women are the ones that made the pots. And the 75% ancestry from the corded ware is from a culture called Yamnaya that were nomadic, who did not have pots, but they had baskets made out of cords. So now we have an understanding of how the corded ware pottery came about. These men, they killed the fathers, brothers, and husbands of these women, these globular amphora women, took them as wives, and they told them, you can make pots, but they need to look like our baskets.
Hmm,
Okay, that's what happened. So now we know the story. The whole story for the last 50 years, candidly in archaeology, was wrong because they didn't
sure.
understand that they were a fundamentally different people, which we now know, right?
Okay. So wait, so you're saying that the genetics led to that discovery in a sense?
Yeah. Oh, wait,
Okay.
here's
So
another example. Here's a
yeah,
counterfactual. Let's say we didn't know anything about North America over the last 500 years.
sure.
Archaeologists could create a story how in the 17th century, um, the semi-forager populations decided to settle down on the eastern seaboard and become agriculturalists and go from wooden like homes to brick homes in places like around Cape Cod in Massachusetts, and it was a natural evolution from the Algonquin cultures. Okay. We know that's not true. We know that a bunch of people came from England and they brought a different culture. Okay.
Sure.
And what we're finding from genetics is that's way more common than the opposite, especially the further back in past you go. So cultural
Okay.
transmission is more important much more recently. The hypothesis that I present, which is not necessarily in the literature, people it's under theorized, is that basically the further back you go, the more humans thought of themselves as like animals, and as opposed to
Mm,
converting or getting people who were their slaves or their tributaries, they looked at it as if it was animal competition. And so
mm,
they would just arrive in an area and just like kill the local people because they're like, we got to use this land for ourselves, as
yeah.
opposed to we could rule over these people, which is something you see in history, right? And so an example of this is when Genghis Khan conquered northern China. His initial intuition was to drive off the peasants and just kill them all, let them starve to death, and then turn all of northern China into a pasture land. But his
Sure.
Kitai advisor, who had like advised the earlier Jurchen emperors, was like, look, here's the map. Here's like how much money you get from the cattle. Here's how much money you get from millions of Chinese peasants. Look at how much more money you get from millions of Chinese peasants. Genghis Khan was like, okay, the math works. You made your case. I think what we see in prehistory, what it's telling us is there were no advisors to explain that you don't need to kill all these people. You could rule them and impose an ideology of rule in some way over them. I think that was an invention probably
Yeah.
around 5,000 years ago. And that's become habitual and common now. Like the Romans imposed, or actually, they didn't even impose Latin, but Latin kind of naturally spread in Western Europe after they took over. But if the 2,000 years before the Romans, what we saw in Western Europe is it looks like there was demographic replacement. That's a polite way of saying that what happened in North America when the white people came is what happened in Europe 5,000 years ago, where you had like replacement after replacement, as people don't seem to like be transmitting the culture. They seem to just die and be replaced by another culture. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean that's my view of history in the sense of it's these kinds of ideas in the humanities, including politics, are discoveries that happen over time. So yeah, if you like you're saying, the idea of ruling over somebody, I think Alexander the Great did that in the West really well, where he went to different places and he discovered it was easier if he goes into India to kind of make himself almost like a god or something, like in their culture, rather than just trying to fight everybody. And I think it's probably a byproduct of trying to stretch yourself overly thin. You kind of realize how necessary it becomes if you want to have that kind of bureaucratic system. So again, that's a kind of discovery in politics that happens. It's a new idea in politics, and Genghis Khan, and I'm sure there's plenty of others during these eras that had that.
Yeah.
I don't know that that's controversial, or maybe it is, but it's not to me. That makes a lot of sense, and I agree with that.
It was in academia insofar as the idea was that pots, not people, moved. So ideas moved.
Pods with a D.
POTS, P-O-T-S.
POTS. Okay.
Yeah, yeah. And so what we're finding in a lot of the genetic literature now, like using ancient DNA, is there's massive population replacement many, many times across many parts of the world, and
Sure.
that's only attenuated over the last really like 2 to 3 thousand years. And I think again that's because of an ideological shift, which has made people rich, wealthy, and result in cultural syntheses and things like that. Peter Turchin, the ecologist and evolutionary biologist of Connecticut, his idea is that the world religions are actually ideological inventions designed to unify ethnically disparate peoples. So it's a meta-ethnic
Wait, say that one
identity.
more time. I'm sorry.
The world religion, so like the idea of Christendom, right? Like everyone's a Christian, right? Well, I mean, that unifies Latin speakers, German speakers, you know, Slavic speakers to some extent before the Orthodox Catholic split. And so the
sure,
idea of these religious ideologies is they span different ethnicities, right? They allow
sure.
unification and they allow trade and various types of intercourse across like different ethnic boundaries because they share something that transcends ethnicity. Because in
Do you
Christ
think that's
there is
that
no
they
Jew or
were
Gentile.
invented for that
Yeah,
purpose or something? Is that what you're saying? Because I agree that Christianity does that, but like
no,
Judaism doesn't, and there's cultures that are more restrictive,
yeah.
or
Judaism.
religions that are. So I don't know if it's innate in
Well, I mean,
religion.
first of all, like I think, like the way I would think with Christianity is Judaism and Christianity are sibling religions. They both come out of classical Judaism, right?
Sure.
And so rabbinical Judaism is basically restricted in what it can do. It used to be much more proselytizing in the past, but with the rise of Islam and Christianity, they can't do that, right? So, but basically, like Christianity and Buddhism are the two cases where they're pan-ethnic very early. Now,
Mhm.
from a perspective of a religious person, that's not the point, but that's irrelevant. When you're talking about like
But I think that's
functionalism, like
one reason why they succeeded in terms of spreading around. Sure. Yeah. Is because they had this kind of like convert to, you just have to accept these kind of principles and you could be a Christian and be one
yeah,
of
yeah.
us
But
essentially,
also, so Peter
or
Turchin,
one like us. Although
Peter Peter
yeah,
Turchin, who I mentioned, you can actually look at the quantitative data of wars and mortalities and fatalities, and there's less conflict within zones demarcated by these meta-ethnic religions, like just war theory and stuff like that. Within Islam, officially, Muslim states are not supposed to engage in war. It should be only with non-Muslim states.
Well, but
Now,
you have
obviously, that's
Shia and Sunni,
yeah, that's
like,
breach. Yeah, that's breach. But I mean, yeah. Well,
but
yeah, the Shia Sunni religious wars, like, I don't want to get into like side. I mean, most people don't know Iran was forcibly converted to Shiism in the 16th century, right? So like the geopolitical like landscape that we have today is actually relatively recent when it comes to that. But anyway,
sure. Okay, so there's a lot about this. I really hope to have this conversation in a longer someday. I know you got to go soon
yeah.
because there's one other thing I really wanted to ask you about that I've
Uh-huh.
always wanted to ask you about. So I'm going to
Okay.
kind of change gears a little bit,
Oh, okay.
which is
Natalism. No, no.
yeah, about natalism and this natalism
Uh-huh.
conference.
Yeah.
So I heard about this through a mutual friend, of ours a couple years ago, and it was pretty shocking to me. And to be honest, not necessarily the idea that we have your most recent podcast is about a birth dearth, that there might
Uh-huh.
be some issue in terms of the replacement, but again, for me, ideology and how ideology is packaged and spread is really important. And I think it has a lot of ramifications we don't think about. So, for instance, I've done some work with ARI in the past, the Ayn Rand Institute, and Dr. Mike Mazza on like the manosphere. And so Mike Mazza has some articles on this that's really interesting about there's often really good advice in the manosphere about, lose
Yeah.
weight if you want to make, but it's packaged and then it's so like the article was red pill poison. So there's good stuff, but then there's all this really nasty ideology underlying it that the good stuff kind of helps you swallow the pill and then
Yeah.
you basically hate women. And I think feminism does the same kind of thing actually. Like the later evidence later iterations of feminism, they would often have like emancipate women in the earlier stages, have the votes, be independent, be thinking, have reproductive
Yeah.
rights. And then it started going into sex is rape, men are evil, you're in this patriarchy that's destroying you. And so but it's packaged in some good and bad. So when I was looking into the natalist thing, that's exactly what I saw, to be perfectly honest. Is there was definitely some interesting insights, but it was really packaged with things that to me were nasty and really dangerous. And so I would love to hear I've heard you talk about why you love kids. In fact, our mutual friend, one of the things she said about you, which I thought was beautiful, was that when you're walking around, if you see a kid, it's almost like Jordan Peterson, pet a cat. Like you
Yeah.
have to stop and like talk to the little kid
Yeah.
because and I think from what I know of you, which I don't know you very well, of course, but you seem to really genuinely love kids.
Yeah.
But again, when I look at the natalist movement and what they're talking about, I see something more than that. And so I'd love
Yeah.
to get some kind of understanding of what this is all about. And
Sure. Sure. Well, I mean, I'm giving a talk there this year, like I did last year.
yeah, and it's coming up in
And
March. It's this month, right?
28th, it's coming up like as we're recording, it's going to come up in like less than 10 days now.
Okay.
I think you post pretty quickly after recording, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, so it'll be before. I mean, obviously. So basically, there's two big factions, I would say, in natalism. There's other factions, and I think the natalist, basically, the concern about the birth rate is spreading to a lot of people because the fertility rates are so low really quickly. A lot of them have crashed within the last 10 years. Lots of the third world, the quote third world, are now like sub replacement. They're below replacement. Some of them are going down to as low as one. Total fertility rate, like one child over the whole lifetime. Okay, so that's happening. There's two big factions. One faction I call the technos, like the technologists. They're into things like IVF, embryo screening, what you would call eugenics, personal eugenics. Okay. The other faction I call trads. So it's like tradcasts, people like
Yeah.
that. Some of them are racial nationalists and like just like right wing influencers and that sort of thing. And so, the two factions it's not a comfortable alliance, but it is insofar as they both are very, very, humans are good, pro humans. Like, how do we figure this out? The technologists are, like Elon's a techno. It's quite clear. I mean, he is an analyst, he is a techno, and he wants people to go to Mars. He wants us to be an interplanetary species. He wants humans to be everywhere that they can. That's quite different than the trans, who kind of wanted to be, like a Christian theocracy type, situation. And some of the trads, but I mean, this is a slightly different faction. And I don't talk about them too much because like I don't know, it's just like they're there, but they're very marginal on the greater American scene. But they're like, we need to have more white children, okay? Because white people are being out reproduced, which this was actually a bigger concern 15 years ago before the birth rate spread all over the world. Because I mean, famously Koreans have the fewest children. So a lot of Latin America has fertility rate now lower than the United States. What? Yeah. So that's also there. That's why I mean that's the part that the media loves because they hate well, I mean, whatever. I don't want to get into it. I think that they're a little too obsessed with white racism because it's like it's there,
A
but it's not.
little
I
too.
don't think. Yeah,
I don't understand why it should matter, to be honest. Of Because like this, that to me seems that's one of the things I saw Kevin Dolan talk about, but he didn't put it that way. But so he was like one of the organizers of the thing of the Natalist conference. Like I don't. So this is where I think there's certain convergence about the genetics and things that I've been concerned about. Is like it being white is not why I have a mixture of things obviously in my genetic background. I haven't done an ancestry or anything like that. I'm interested in it. But that's not why I like freedom and I believe in free will, and I think
yeah,
that we should have a more limited government that protects individual rights. It has nothing to
sure,
do with my ethnicity or my skin color. And
yeah,
that I think is so when I hear them talk, what they often do talk about and why you should have kids, because this is my thing. I think there is a fun or good argument to say to someone about how to think positively about children and how you should have it. I don't think it's this sociological, way that they couch it in terms of the world is going to come, civilization is going to come to an end. What he means by that, I think, though, when you ask him or look at it, is like a certain kind of white civilization that he's afraid of going away.
sure,
And and the question is, why does he think that white is associated with this kind of Western,
yeah,
ideology? And that's where I start becoming, or not start, that's where I have real issues.
yeah. Well, the problem is like I can't really engage you on that because I don't have those concerns, right? It's
So what
just
are
the
your
opposite.
concerns? Okay, then I apologize.
Like my
What are your,
no, 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 no. I'm just saying my concerns are like when you have an old society, innovation disappears. Like people are
okay.
concerned when you have old people, like I mean, and there is like social science evidence of this.
Yeah, they
When
don't
you
no,
have
I agree.
yeah,
We don't innovate as our minds deteriorate a little bit over
yeah, yeah,
time,
yeah. Well, yeah, the
you
interests
know,
and the priorities are
and the
different. We
interest,
already see this.
yeah, yeah.
We
We
already,
see
I mean,
this
like
with
we're, I think
100%.
we're both, I think we're both Gen X or elder millennials. I mean, I don't want to get into like boomer hate, but they're not letting go. And
Sure.
they're still the biggest. They're going to be the biggest generation until 2030 when enough of them die. And so
Okay.
they're a shadow over our society. In places like Japan, and like Japan's a great country, but
Right.
there's old people are everywhere. They sell more diapers for adults than they do for babies, and it just creates a different culture with like different priorities. You want
Sure.
stability, you want quiet, you don't want dynamism. Dynamism is for the young because like the young do crazy things. Old people got the crazy things out of their system, right?
Yeah.
And so if we have a society where there's just like proportionally very few young people not you don't even understand in a democratic way, just like aggregately the interests of the aged will loom large, okay? And from like the perspective of humanity should go to the stars and fill up the universe with life. The first step is to get off this planet and make us interplanetary. That's actually feasible.
Yes.
Going to
I
another
agree.
solar system, like I don't know, with organic bodies, that's a different issue. But
Sure.
basically, I mean, I'm not gonna lie, I have like transhumanist, ambitions, right? So natalism for me is part of a transhumanist vision, of a vision of like transcending who we are right now as embodied apes on planet Earth that are playing with technology, even though we should be like,
But
throwing food
let
at
me
each
ask you
other,
something that you talked about a minute ago that seems to me a counterexample to what you're saying. So I look, I agree that we often do deteriorate over time, right, in our innovation and adventurousness. But again, having young people is not necessarily that they're going to be super innovative either. I think there's lots of cultures with lots of young people, and I don't think they're super adventurous. Like I think Gen Z seems to be less romantic, less adventurous. They seem to be much more tracked, and they're young too. So
I,
where I
yeah,
agree with you
yeah,
is
yeah,
the value of youthfulness. I think that's wonderful. I think the value of humans is wonderful. I think that's wonderful. Like I like Jeff Bezos has this whole thing about why he wants to go to the stars, or not the stars, but he wants, these space stations because he thinks we could have 3 trillion people. And that means, thousands of Einsteins and thousands of
yeah,
Mozarts. And that's my view, in the sense of that's why I want to have people in that sense, for sure. So
yeah,
I think that's wonderful, that part of it. But it
yeah. I
seems
mean,
like there's an issue in terms of, what, like, again, I keep hearing this. It's We're going to have a collapse of something, which doesn't seem to be your argument. So that's, I don't want to
no, it's
push you
not.
there.
It's not. I'm not a collapse person. I'm more of a senescence person.
What was the
You
word?
know, senescence. Just like age, we will age as a
Scientificism. Okay.
civilization. Senescence. We will age as a civilization, as a
Sure.
species, and which is. I mean, I'm not going to say it's fine, but it can be fine. Like that's what our history. We've been foragers for a million years. That's all
Sure.
we did.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
Stay
what's your
physically.
argument for why I should have a kid? I don't have kids.
I don't make people. I don't actually argue to individual people because
Okay.
everyone has their
What?
own life.
So then, well, then how do you
Let me,
make,
let me, let me-
then what's the argument for making kids, having kids in general, if not for
well,
me?
because it's aggravating. Okay, so first of all, like, I mean, do you have a retirement plan? Do you plan to retire someday?
Well, no, and
Okay,
like only if I have to. So I want to prepare for the
yeah, okay. No, I
eventuality
mean,
if I have
but
to. But
the fundamental issue is, even if you don't want to have kids, you don't think that you're the type of person that'll be good at having kids. And there are people like that. Um, you know,
I think
they
I'd be
should
good
feel
at the making of the kids. But
they should, yeah, that's fair. We don't need to get to that. But like, you do need young people our economic system is dependent on young people who produce and do not consume as much. Like things like healthcare services, for example, right?
sure, I
Like
agree with
it's a
that.
trade-off. Like you could say it's a Ponzi scheme, it is what it is, but that's fundamental truth. So even if you don't have kids individually, you selfishly should hope that other people have kids so the economy continues to be
Okay,
dynamic
so I've
and
heard,
productive
yeah,
when
yeah.
you're old, right?
That, yeah,
Uh,
so like I am paying for my parents and other parents, right now through their social security and all that stuff.
yeah,
I'm paying into
and
that system.
it's
So
beyond Social Security.
I
It's
agree that I
beyond that.
am
Yeah,
paying that. I
yeah,
agree with that.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And it's beyond Social Security. Like people think about Social Security because it's very explicit and concrete.
Well, and
But the
health.
reality
Yeah,
is,
yeah, yeah.
yeah, the whole economy is driven, like like our like post-war baby boom drove an economic uplift, right? And so as the number of people in the younger age cohort shrinks, you're gonna
Well,
have like things like deflationary spirals, and it's just like the dependency ratio is whack, right? Like people will just have to like live poorer because they have fewer younger people driving the whole economy. The productivity will decline.
yeah, so I know you're running out of time. I really want to dig into this more with you. Because there's economic premises that I keep hearing that I don't think are accurate. I don't think the baby boom, for instance, drove the economic progress post World War II. I don't think it hurt it. I don't think it's irrelevant, but I don't think that's the fundamental factor. Being more productive
Yeah, no, no,
individually, but
that's
and
obviously like that's true. Like productivity gains are like the
but like
dominant effect.
if today with AI, for instance, a 65-year-old is able to
Yeah,
all of a sudden, with all their wisdom and experience and knowledge, have another 20 years of great productiveness, in their lives,
yeah,
that's way better in a lot of ways. Now, to the degree that it's that not that that is not what's harming younger people. What's harming younger people is that we have this massive social system. So, me as an objectivist, and the movement that I try to support is the idea of we need to find ways and arguments to get more and more limited government, to try to help, because that's really the encroachment on the individual and the productiveness that we're capable of. Not
yeah,
the, but it is. So what that does is it does make us have to pay for older people, also sick people, also unproductive young people, right? All types of people that we shouldn't be paying for, not just the old. I don't think there's anything wrong with old people, old people. I want to
do
live
you,
to 150 years old or more. I'm excited about genetics and all these things because of all the exciting, advancements possible in living longer,
Yeah,
and healthier in like a health span kind of way.
yeah.
I think that's
Okay, so
wonderful.
let me, because we are like short on time here. So
Yeah,
let's
you
do
want to go
something
5 more
quick.
minutes, maybe say?
Yeah.
Okay.
And have you read Arthur C. Clarke, like the author of 2001, Space
Yes.
Odyssey?
Yeah.
Like, have you
Long
read
time
his
ago.
book, City of was it like City of Stars? I think. So
Is
basically,
it
it's
just The
about
Star? I think it's
no. Let me just see.
there was a famous uh, book I read a long time ago just called The Star. Yeah, a short story by this Arthur C. Clarke called The Star.
Yeah, I'm gonna get the.
I've read that, but that's been a long time. Um,
Okay. So it was called Against the Fall of the Night, and later it got readapted, The City of the Stars.
oh, okay.
So basically,
I'll
this is
check it
about
out.
a future where humans are basically immortal, and they have all the
Mm,
technology, and they have all these AIs, and they have all these robots, right? But basically, these and like there's a child, I think Alvin, is his name? And he was born in the city, and they haven't like left the city in like a billion years or something ridiculous. Because
mhm.
people are like, well, we don't know what's outside, and we don't know what's out in the world, but like we live forever, and we don't want to like risk ourselves and all this stuff, right? This is like natalism is not like just this, but my point is, as someone who read science fiction in my youth, that is a future that I want to escape. I don't want a future where people are just happy. They stay in their houses, they eat their food, they engage in their hedonic satisfaction, and they don't go out into the universe.
I
They
think
take
you and I
no
are
risks. They
similar
don't,
in that. Yeah.
yeah, and so
Adventurousness. Have it,
yes,
like
adventurousness.
expand your
And,
life,
and
meet new
so youth,
people. Yeah.
youth. I mean, and we're both getting older, okay? And I mean, I try to maintain a youthful
You're
orientation,
very
which
youthful, yes. Whenever I hang out
you
with you,
know,
for sure.
yeah. But just as you get older, you see more things and you get more cautious, and these are just natural things that happens to everybody, and we all know this. And
Yeah.
that's why children, new life, innocence. Like they look at the world and they don't say why not because they don't know. They
Yeah.
haven't
Yeah.
experienced the pains and all, which is good. They will. It happens in life, believe it or
Sure.
not. Like I will tell them. I was talking to a young person recently, and I was had an argument with her. A young person, she just turned 30. Okay,
That's young.
and
That's very young.
I was saying to them, we have an argument, and she's like, blah blah blah. And I was like, whatever. Like, and she's like, well, you don't want to keep arguing. You don't want to convince me. I'm like, I'm not gonna be able to convince you. She's like, why? I'm like, because I wasn't convinced when I was your age because I knew everything.
But
And she's
okay, but hold on, Razib. So I love that, and I've had that experience a lot, of course, myself.
yeah, yeah,
That's but so it's so one, I think the mission of wanting more people and mission, whatever call it, vision of having more people that maintain a youthful exuberance for life, I think is a great way to live your life and try to spread the joy and like have a kind of resplendent joy. I think I have that to a large degree. Like it's why I
yeah,
like to
you,
podcast because I like to
yeah,
experience new things and I want to help other people have that experience. But the cynicism that often comes with age
yeah,
can doesn't have to happen. It's a choice that, so the wisdom of the experience you just had
yes, yes,
is that
yes,
what you can really learn from that experience, and I'm sure
yeah,
you know this if you sat back, is not that you as a 30-year-old had that you knew everything, but it's the knowledge of how change internally occurs to a person.
yeah,
So, and that's wisdom, that's knowledge applied to, so in other words, if I'm talking to a younger person and I see that kind of, I know they're going to have those barriers. My thought is not, I want to barrel down on them like I was 20. Like I remember when I was 20 getting into objectivism, I like printed out or I basically typed up and almost paraphrased all of Man's Rights by Ayn Rand and like handed it to this random kid when I was like 18. And this is why objectivists have this, they have this, people think of them in a certain way because they were that way as in their youth. But now I understand, like, I want to listen to you, Razib, and your thoughts and your ideas. And I'm going to maybe plant a little thing for you to think about that we could talk about in the future, or that you can ingest on your, that's, you don't have to lose your inner desire and passion for life. Most people do. And why they do is an interesting question. I think it's an individual question, and there's things we could look at sociologically. But I'm with you in that desire. It's why I try to get people to read literature. I think that helps spark the imagination. It helps. You same thing with all great art. I think it does that. Theater. I think there's a sense of wonder that's automatic when you go to the theater. So I'm with you. So I know you need to go, so I'm going to let you go. If you had any last thoughts on what we talked about to kind of close the loop on natalism,
Yeah.
and genetics, and then I hope you'll come over sometime, and
Yeah.
maybe you come over in the afternoon. I'll get you a drink so we can see what you're
Yeah.
like with
Get chill
a
out.
couple of drinks in you, and then end on
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
podcast.
Yeah. So last time is that, obviously the wisdom does come with age. You learn more. My point, I do want to reiterate is sometimes it's just good to be dumb and hopeful. 60,000
Sure.
years ago, some humans decide to be crazy and walk into the Sahara, and everyone else is like, "What the hell are you thinking?" But
Yeah.
they came out on the other side of the Sahara and populated, like, 5 other continents. Okay,
Yeah.
so sometimes not knowing and not being wise allows you to make great discoveries. Okay, and
Sure.
that's just fundamentally truth. The other thing is, like, I will say to your audience and to the objectivists, I do enjoy talking to objectivists because your thoughts are clear and you do believe in logic. And what I love about objectivists is, and I think some people will be surprised that I say this because they may have different experiences, but I feel you are not arguing to win the argument. You are arguing to understand what is going on. And
Hmm.
that is what I love about you guys. And I love having discussions with people where they don't really want to win on points. They want to actually win by understanding the world around them. And sometimes that means that they will acknowledge that they are incorrect and wrong. And that's okay because it's
Sure.
not about winning, it's about understanding.
That's what it should be. Absolutely. Well, we'll have to, if you ever are interested in coming to speak at something, I do
Sure,
like a
sure.
monthly event.
Yeah, I
I think it'd
know.
be a
I
lot of
know.
fun for you to speak there. I
Yeah,
think
yeah.
also a lot of people would be interested in coming and hearing
Yeah,
you,
yeah, yeah. I mean,
and probably challenging you, because that,
yeah,
that
yeah,
objectivists do have that image, and it's true. And not just I think it's because the people that are intellectual are attracted to the movement.
yeah.
Right?
Yeah,
So,
I mean,
uh,
it's not just about the game, though. It's about what the point of the game is, right?
exactly.
The point of
Yeah.
the
And
game,
I
the point
think
of the
that's
game is
really
to
important,
understand.
and to get better and understand each other. So, well, thank you so much for your time. I do hope we see each other in person soon. I think it's been over a year now.
Yeah,
And hopefully we can hang out. But
for sure, man. Well, nice
appreciate it.
talking to you.
All right. Take care, Razib.